The cabin door slammed shut behind him, and Boone Carter found himself trapped with the one person he'd spent years avoiding. The storm outside wasn't the only thing that would change everything that night. She sat quietly in the corner, larger than life in every way he'd been taught to judge. But Mercy Whitmore wasn't looking at him with the shame he expected. Instead, her eyes held something he couldn't identify, a knowing look that made his stomach twist. The wind howled like it was angry, rattling the windows in a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate, as if the storm had been waiting for exactly this moment to trap them together. Boone tried the door handle, locked from the outside. That's when he noticed the fresh scratches on the wood frame, and the way Mercy's hands weren't shaking despite the cold. She'd been here before. She'd been expecting this. "You're wondering why the door locked by itself," she said without looking up from the small object she was carving with her knife. "And you're wondering why I'm not surprised." The object in her hands caught the firelight. Intricate, purposeful, like nothing he'd ever seen. But it was the sound that made his blood freeze. Footsteps outside, heavy boots circling the cabin in the storm. Mercy finally looked at him, and her smile was nothing like what he'd expected from someone who looked like her. "They've been hunting me for 3 years, Boone Carter, and now they found us both." Boone's mind raced as he processed her words. 3 years. That meant she'd been running since before he'd even known her name. The footsteps outside grew more deliberate, more organized. These weren't random travelers seeking shelter. "Who's hunting you?" he whispered, instinctively moving away from the windows. Mercy continued carving, her thick fingers surprisingly nimble with the blade. "Same men who burned down the Henderson Ranch. Same ones who made the marshal disappear last spring." She paused, finally meeting his eyes. "Same ones who've been watching you." Boone. His blood turned cold. The Henderson Ranch fire had been ruled an accident. The marshal's disappearance was blamed on Indian raids. But now, watching Mercy's calm certainty, those official stories crumbled like dust. "That's impossible. I'm nobody important. You think being the only witness to their cattle-rustling operation makes you nobody?" Her laugh was bitter. "You saw them moving stolen herds through your land 6 months ago. You told yourself it was your imagination." The memory hit him like a physical blow. That night in early spring when he'd seen men driving cattle across his property in the darkness, branded cattle that didn't belong to any local rancher. He'd convinced himself it was a mistake, that he'd been drinking too much again. "How do you know about that?" "Because I've been watching them watch you, waiting for them to make their move." She stood up, and Boone realized how wrong he'd been about everything. Mercy wasn't slow or clumsy. She moved with the calculated precision of someone who'd spent years surviving. "The storm isn't natural timing, Boone. They've been waiting for a night like this. No witnesses, no escape routes." The footsteps stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the noise. Then came the voice that made Mercy's jaw clench. "We know you're in there, fat woman. Send out Carter and maybe we'll let you live long enough to run again." Mercy's reaction wasn't what Boone expected. Instead of fear, her face hardened into something that looked almost predatory. She walked to the window with surprising grace, peering through a gap in the boards he hadn't noticed before. 4 men, maybe 5. Her voice was steady, calculating. "They're not as smart as they think." Boone felt his world tilting. Everything he thought he knew about this woman was wrong. "You're talking like you've done this before. More times than I care to count." She moved to a loose floorboard near the fireplace, prying it up to reveal a hidden cache. Inside were items that made Boone's mouth go dry. Ammunition, a second rifle, oiled and ready, and something that looked like dynamite. "Jesus Christ, Mercy. What are you?" She pulled out the rifle, checking the chamber with practiced efficiency. "I'm the daughter of the man they killed first, James Whitmore. Ever heard of him?" The name hit Boone like a sledgehammer. James Whitmore had been the territorial investigator who disappeared 2 years ago while investigating cattle rustling. The official report said he'd been killed by wolves. "Your father was murdered for getting too close to the truth, just like they're planning to murder you." She handed him the second rifle. "The difference is, this time they're not dealing with an unarmed investigator." Outside, the voices grew more aggressive. "We ain't got all night, Carter. Come out, or we burn the whole thing down with both of you inside." Mercy smiled, and there was something genuinely frightening about it. "Let them try. This cabin's been modified." For the first time, Boone really looked at his surroundings. The windows weren't just boarded up randomly. They were reinforced with metal strips. The walls were thicker than normal. Even the roof looked reinforced. You've been planning this. For 3 years. Ever since they killed my father, I've been preparing for the day they'd corner me. She checked her ammunition again. What I didn't plan for was having company. I never asked to be here. No, but you're here now. And unless you want to die like a sheep, you'll listen to what I tell you. The smell of smoke began to drift through the walls. They were making good on their threat. But Mercy didn't look worried. If anything, she looked satisfied. Good. They're doing exactly what I expected. She moved to another section of the wall, revealing a hidden rifle port. Fire spread slow on green wood. We've got maybe 10 minutes before it becomes a real problem. 10 minutes to do what? To teach them that fat doesn't mean helpless. She positioned herself at the rifle port, taking careful aim. And to show you what your witness testimony is really worth. The first shot rang out, followed immediately by a scream from outside. When Mercy turned back to him, Boone saw something in her eyes that terrified and amazed him. This wasn't the helpless woman he'd judged by her appearance. This was a hunter who'd been waiting 3 years for her prey to come within range. The scream outside was followed by angry shouting and the sound of men scrambling for cover. Mercy worked the rifle bolt with mechanical precision, already lining up her next shot. That was Murphy, she said calmly, recognizable by his limp, shoulder wound, non-fatal. Boone stared at her in disbelief. You know their names? I know everything about them. Clay Murphy, the one I just shot. Thomas Redding, their leader. Frank Kaczynski, the one with the scar across his nose. And Billy Tate, barely 18 and too stupid to realize he's riding with killers. She fired again, and another cry of pain echoed through the storm. That's Frank, also non-fatal, but he'll think twice before rushing the door. The casual way she discussed wounding men made Boone's stomach churn, but he couldn't deny the effectiveness. These weren't random shots. Every bullet was placed with surgical precision. How many people have you killed, Mercy? None. Yet. Her answer was matter of fact. Killing brings the law, even corrupt law. Wounded men can be questioned. Dead men just create more mysteries. Outside, Redding's voice boomed through the storm. Enough games, woman. We've got all night. And that fire's spreading faster than you think. Mercy glanced at the smoke seeping through the walls. The acrid smell was getting stronger, but she still didn't look concerned. Actually, you don't have all night. Thomas. She raised her voice so they could hear her outside. Because I sent word to the territorial marshal 3 days ago. Should be arriving with a full posse right about dawn. The silence that followed was telling. Boone watched Mercy's face carefully. Did you really contact the marshal? Of course not. The territorial marshal is probably on their payroll. She reloaded methodically. But they don't know that I know that. Doubt is a powerful weapon. Another shot fired from outside, splintering wood near the window. They were getting desperate, which meant more dangerous. What's your real plan, Mercy? Because this cabin won't hold forever. The plan is to survive until something changes the game. She moved to check another rifle port. And to make sure you understand what you're really mixed up in. I told you I never asked to be part of this. But you are. The moment you saw those cattle, you became a threat to an operation that spans 3 territories. They've stolen over 2,000 head in the past year, selling them to buyers in Colorado who don't ask questions about brands. Boone felt the weight of her words settling over him like a death shroud. 2,000 head is worth more than most towns see in 5 years, enough money to buy sheriffs, judges, even territorial officials. She paused her reloading to look directly at him. Enough money to make killing witnesses seem like a reasonable business expense. The smoke was getting thicker now, and the heat from the spreading fire was becoming uncomfortable. Mercy seemed to notice this for the first time, and something flickered across her face that might have been concern. Time for Phase 2, she muttered, moving toward the back wall of the cabin. What's Phase 2? But she was already prying up another section of floorboard, revealing something that made Boone's heart stop. A tunnel opening, dark and narrow, leading away from the cabin into the earth below. Mercy grabbed a lantern and started down into the tunnel without hesitation. Move, Boone. Unless you prefer being roasted alive. The tunnel was narrow but well constructed, lined with wooden supports that spoke of careful planning. As they crawled through the darkness, Boone's mind reeled with questions. How long did this take you to dig? 6 months. Nights, mostly. Had to be careful about the noise. Her voice echoed strangely in the confined space. This tunnel connects to a natural cave system about 200 yards from the cabin. Behind them, the sound of the fire grew louder. punctuated by the men's increasingly frantic shouts. They'd realized their prey was escaping. "There's another way in," Boone said suddenly. "That's why you weren't worried about the fire." "Smart man. Took you long enough." The tunnel opened into a wider space, and Mercy raised the lantern to reveal a natural cave chamber. But this wasn't just a hiding place. The walls were lined with supplies. Food, water, ammunition, and what looked like months' worth of provisions. "Jesus, Mercy, you've been living like a hunted animal. Better a live animal than a dead hero." She moved to a crack in the cave wall that showed a sliver of gray light. "Dawn's coming faster than I expected. That changes things." "Changes them how?" "Because if there really was a marshal coming, this would be when he'd arrive." She paused, listening to something Boone couldn't hear. "And if there isn't?" The sound of hoofbeats echoed from outside the cave entrance. Multiple horses moving fast. Mercy's face went rigid with concentration as she counted the rhythm. 5 horses, moving in formation. That's either very good news or very bad news. She grabbed a rifle and moved toward the cave mouth, gesturing for Boone to stay back. The hoofbeats stopped near where the cabin would be. Voices carried on the wind but too distant to make out words. Then came the sound that made Mercy's shoulders slump with relief. "Federal Marshal, everybody on the ground, hands visible." The authority in the voice was unmistakable. Real law enforcement, not the corrupted local variety. "Well," Mercy said quietly, "looks like someone did contact the marshal after all. But you said you didn't." "I didn't. But my father trained me well. Always have a backup plan for your backup plan." She was moving back toward the tunnel entrance. 3 days ago, I sent a letter to my father's old partner in Denver. Told him everything I'd learned about the cattle operation. The sound of gunfire erupted outside, but it was brief and one-sided. Professional law enforcement against desperate criminals rarely lasted long. "Why didn't you tell me about the letter?" "Because hope is dangerous when you're trying to survive. Better to plan for the worst and be surprised by the best." They could hear the marshal's men moving through the area, calling out orders and securing prisoners. Mercy sat down heavily on a supply crate, and for the first time since this ordeal began, she looked tired. "Is it over?" Boone asked. "This part is. But now comes the hard part. What's harder than being hunted by killers? Testifying. Facing a courtroom full of people who'll judge me by what they see, not what I've done." She looked at him with those knowing eyes again. "People like you did, until tonight." Boone felt heat rise in his cheeks. She was right, and they both knew it. "Mercy, save it. Actions matter more than apologies." She stood up, shouldering her rifle. "Question is, when we walk out of this cave, what kind of man are you going to be?" They emerged from the cave into the gray light of dawn to find the scene transformed. 3 men lay face down in the mud, hands bound behind their backs. The 4th, Billy Tate, sat against a tree with his head in his hands, looking younger than his 18 years. The cabin was a smoldering ruin, smoke still rising from the charred remains. Marshal William Hayes stood over the prisoners, a tall man with silver hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades enforcing law in hard places. When he saw Mercy emerge from the cave, his expression softened with something that looked like pride. "Miss Whitmore, your father would be proud of what you've accomplished here." "Marshal Hayes." Mercy's voice was steady, but Boone caught the slight tremor of emotion. "I wasn't sure the letter would reach you in time. Got to Denver 2 days after your father's partner received it. Rode hard with my best men." He gestured to the prisoners. "These 4 are just the beginning. We've been tracking this operation for months but couldn't get close enough for solid evidence." "The evidence is in the cave," Mercy said. "Maps, ledgers, everything my father gathered before they killed him, plus what I've added in the 3 years since." Hayes nodded approvingly. Then his gaze shifted to Boone. The weight of that stare made Boone acutely aware of how he must look. Disheveled, scared, and standing next to a woman he'd spent years avoiding because of her appearance. "Mr. Carter, I believe. Miss Whitmore's letter mentioned you witnessed cattle movement through your property." "I did." Boone's voice came out rougher than intended. 6 months ago, I should have reported it immediately." "Should have, yes. But you're reporting it now, and that's what matters." Hayes pulled out a leather notebook. "I'll need detailed testimony about what you saw, when you saw it, and anything else that might be relevant." As Hayes took his statement, Boone became increasingly aware of how thoroughly Mercy had prepared for this moment. Every question the marshal asked, she had supporting evidence for. Every detail Boone provided, She could corroborate with additional information. "How long have you been planning this operation, Miss Whitmore?" Hayes asked when they finished with Boone's testimony. "Since the day I found my father's body." Her voice was matter of fact, but Boone saw her hands clench slightly. He'd hidden his real investigation notes in a place only I knew about. "It took me 3 years to gather enough additional evidence to be certain of conviction." And Mr. Carter's testimony was the final piece. "His testimony proves the operation extended beyond what my father had documented. It shows a pattern that will be impossible for their lawyers to dismiss as coincidence." Hayes closed his notebook with satisfaction. "Then we have them, all of them." But as he spoke, Boone noticed something troubling. Billy Tate was watching Mercy with an expression of pure hatred, his young face twisted with rage that hadn't been there moments before. "She killed my brother," Billy suddenly shouted, struggling against his bonds. "Murphy was all the family I had left, and she shot him down like a dog." "Your brother chose his path," Hayes said firmly. "Non-fatal wound, as I understand it." "Don't matter. She destroyed everything." Billy's voice cracked with the emotion of a boy trying to sound like a man. "This ain't over, fat woman. Even if they hang us, this ain't over." The venom in his words made Boone step protectively closer to Mercy, an instinct that surprised him. 3 days ago, he wouldn't have crossed the street to help her. Now he found himself ready to defend her against a bound prisoner's threats. Mercy looked at Billy with something that might have been pity. "Your brother made his choices, boy, just like you made yours when you decided to ride with killers." She turned to Marshal Hayes. "Billy's the youngest. If he cooperates fully, testifies against the others, he might avoid the gallows." "That's for a judge to decide," Hayes replied, but his tone suggested he wasn't unsympathetic to the idea. Billy spat in the dirt. "I ain't testifying against nobody. We stick together or we don't stick at all." "Then you'll hang together," Mercy said simply. "Your choice." As Hayes organized his men to transport the prisoners, Boone found himself studying Mercy with new eyes. Throughout this entire ordeal, she'd been 3 steps ahead of everyone else. The tunnel, the evidence cache, the letter to Denver, even the non-fatal shooting strategy. Every action had been calculated, purposeful, and ultimately effective. "Why did you help me?" he asked quietly. "You could have just stayed hidden until the marshal arrived. Let them take me and be done with it." "Because my father taught me that the law only works when good people are willing to stand up and testify, regardless of the personal cost." She paused, watching as Hayes's men loaded the prisoners onto horses. "And because I needed you to see who I really am, not what you assumed I was." The words hit him harder than any physical blow. "Mercy, I'm sorry. I was wrong about everything. Apologies are easy, Boone. What matters is what you do next." She gestured toward the smoldering remains of the cabin. "This was my home for 3 years. My fortress, my father's memorial. Now it's gone. You could rebuild? No. This chapter of my life is over." She shouldered her rifle and began walking toward where Hayes had left a spare horse. "Time to start a new one. What will you do now?" "Testify at the trial. Make sure these men face justice for what they did to my father and all the other people they've hurt." She paused, one foot in the stirrup. "After that, maybe buy some land. Start fresh somewhere new." Boone watched her mount the horse with surprising grace for someone of her size. Everything about this woman challenged his preconceptions. "Could you use a partner?" The words came out before he'd fully thought them through, but he didn't regret them. "Someone who knows cattle, knows the land, and owes you more than he can ever repay?" Mercy studied his face for a long moment, those knowing eyes searching for something. "You sure about that, Boone Carter? Partnership means treating someone as an equal, regardless of what they look like." "I'm sure." And surprisingly, he was. The woman who'd saved his life, outsmarted hardened criminals, and spent 3 years preparing for justice deserved better than the shallow judgment he'd shown her. "I've learned more about courage in one night than I did in the previous 30 years. Courage is just fear that's been properly directed," she said, echoing something that sounded like her father's wisdom. "Question is, what are you going to direct your fear toward now?" Hayes called out that it was time to move. The prisoners needed to be transported to the territorial jail, and there would be preliminary hearings to prepare for. As they rode toward town together, Boone realized that the storm hadn't just trapped them in a cabin. It had washed away his old assumptions and left him free to see clearly for the first time in years. But he also knew that the real test would come later, when they stood in a courtroom full of people who would judge Mercy the same way he once had. The territorial courthouse in Cedar Rapids was packed beyond capacity when the trial began 2 weeks later. Word had spread about the cattle rustling operation, and every rancher within 100 miles wanted to see justice served. Boone sat in the front row, watching as Mercy took the witness stand with the same calm composure she'd shown in the burning cabin. Judge Morrison, a stern man with wire-rimmed spectacles, reviewed the extensive evidence Mercy had compiled. Maps, ledgers, correspondence, and testimony from the captured men who'd chosen to cooperate rather than face the gallows. Billy Tate had remained silent, but Murphy and Frank had both agreed to testify against Thomas Redding in exchange for reduced sentences. Miss Whitmore, the prosecutor began, please tell the court how your investigation began. Mercy's voice carried clearly through the packed courtroom. 3 years ago, I found my father's body near Willow Creek. The official report claimed wolf attack, but the wounds were made by knives, not teeth. I knew someone had murdered him. A murmur ran through the crowd. The official story had been accepted without question until now. What did you do with this knowledge? I searched his belongings and found his hidden investigation notes. My father had been tracking a cattle rustling operation for months. He'd identified the key players and their methods, but he was killed before he could present his evidence. The prosecutor held up a leather-bound journal. Is this your father's notebook? Yes. It contains details of stolen cattle, forged brands, and the names of corrupt officials who facilitated the operation. Boone watched the faces in the courtroom as Mercy testified. Some showed sympathy and admiration for her dedication to justice. Others displayed the same prejudice he'd once carried, judging her by appearance rather than actions. When it came time for his own testimony, Boone stood and walked to the witness stand with steady steps. The defense attorney, a slick man from Denver, immediately tried to discredit him. Mr. Carter, isn't it true that you were drinking heavily on the night in question? That your supposed sighting of cattle movement could have been a hallucination? I had been drinking that evening, Boone admitted, but what I saw was real. 40 to 50 head of cattle being driven across my land in the darkness. Cattle with brands I didn't recognize. And yet you said nothing for 6 months. Why should this court believe your convenient memory? Boone looked directly at Mercy, drawing strength from her steady gaze. Because I was a coward. I convinced myself it was my imagination because facing the truth would have required courage I didn't possess at the time. And what changed? I learned what real courage looks like. I learned it from Miss Whitmore, who spent 3 years gathering evidence while those same men hunted her. She risked everything to see justice done, while I hid behind my own prejudices and fears. The defense attorney tried to continue his attack, but Boone's honest admission had clearly affected the jury. When Marshal Hayes testified about the evidence found in Mercy's cave and the capture of the criminals, the case became overwhelming. During the closing arguments, the defense tried one last desperate strategy. They argued that Mercy's size and appearance made her an unreliable witness, that her gender made her emotional rather than rational, that her obsession with her father's death had clouded her judgment. Boone felt his jaw clench as he listened to these attacks on the woman who'd saved his life and opened his eyes to his own moral failings. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood with the gravity of a man delivering final judgment. We find Thomas Redding guilty of cattle rustling, conspiracy, and murder in the first degree. We recommend hanging. Similar verdicts followed for Murphy and Frank, though their cooperation earned them life imprisonment instead of death. Billy Tate, defiant to the end, received a 20-year sentence. As the judge pronounced the sentences, Boone watched Mercy's face. There was no triumph there, no satisfaction in victory, only the quiet relief of someone who'd finally laid a burden down after carrying it for years. Outside the courthouse, the crowd buzzed with conversations about the trial. Some praised Mercy's determination and intelligence. Others still whispered cruel comments about her appearance, unable to see past their own prejudices. Boone heard one rancher mutter to another, "Hard to believe a woman that size could outsmart professional criminals." Without thinking, Boone turned and faced the man. "That woman saved my life and brought justice to killers who'd been operating freely for years. Her size had nothing to do with her courage or intelligence." The rancher looked embarrassed and mumbled an apology before walking away. Mercy approached him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You didn't have to defend me, Boone." "Yes, I did. Partners defend each other. So you're still serious about that partnership?" "More serious than I've ever been about anything." He pulled a folded document from his coat pocket. "I've been to the land office. There's good grazing territory available about 50 miles south of here. Far enough from these memories, close enough to honest law enforcement. Mercy examined the deed papers with interest. You bought land without consulting your partner? I bought half the land. The other half is waiting for you to sign your name to the deed. He paused, realizing how presumptuous that might sound. Assuming you still want to start fresh somewhere new. For the first time since he'd known her, Mercy smiled without reservation. It transformed her entire face, revealing a warmth and beauty that had nothing to do with conventional standards. I accept your partnership, Boone Carter, but I have conditions. Name them. Equal ownership, equal decision-making, equal work. No special treatment because I'm a woman. No assumptions because of my size. Agreed. And if you ever treat me differently because of how I look, the partnership ends immediately. You have my word. She extended her hand, and when he shook it, her grip was firm and calloused from years of hard work. Then let's go build something better than what we're leaving behind. As they walked toward their horses, Marshal Hayes approached them. Miss Whitmore, the territorial governor wants to offer you a position as an investigator. Your methods and dedication have impressed some important people. Mercy considered this for a moment, then shook her head. Thank you, Marshal, but I've spent 3 years seeking justice for the past. Now, I want to build something for the future. Hayes nodded approvingly. Good choice, both of you. 6 months later, the Carter-Whitmore ranch was thriving. Their cattle were healthy, their land was productive, and their partnership had proven as strong in business as it had been in crisis. Boone had learned that true strength came in many forms, and that the most important qualities in a person couldn't be seen from the outside. Mercy had found peace in building something new, rather than dwelling on past injustices. And together, they'd created something that neither could have achieved alone. Sometimes the storm that traps you with someone unexpected is exactly what you need to discover who you really are. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier, where unlikely partnerships and hidden courage change everything. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.